is Yale University history professor Timothy Snyder. He's the author of the best-selling book on Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Tim, good to see you again. Thank you for joining us. And I think you approach a particularly interesting part of the motivation for this trial, and that is the upholding of democracy in the face of a existential threat to it. This authoritarian coup attempt is actually an existential threat to democracy.
Well, it's an existential threat, first of all, to the rule of law. I mean, the basic question is, do you have a government which is run according to law, or do you have a government which is run according to violence or the threats of violence? The second big question, as you say, is, do you have a democracy where people are not afraid to vote and where lawmakers are not afraid to make the right judgments? Or do you have a system where the vote itself is held hostage and where fear ends up governing instead of ballots? That's where we are. I mean, as a historian, what I think about is, how are we going to remember this? How are the history books going to remember this? How are we going to teach our children and grandchildren about this? I mean, for me, we know what happened now, but the crucial thing is, can we teach people about the rule of law and democracy into the future? And to do that, there has to be a trial, or a number of trials, or a procedure where we go through the facts, have a clear conclusion before we move on.
So you say a number of trials, and that's interesting because Donald Trump is a great figurehead to identify as the leader of this movement. But as we know, this is far more of a conspiracy. There are way more people involved. The Attorney General of Texas was encouraging these falsehoods, these lies about the election. We know now from this overnight reporting that the Department of Justice, there was somebody senior in the Department of Justice who was involved in advancing Donald Trump's plan to overturn the results of the election. And we know about Senators Hawley and Cruz, who in the very moment that insurrection was taking place on Congress, Cruz was sending out fundraising emails. How do you take in the totality of this whole thing, that this attempt at authoritarianism had spread far beyond Donald Trump?
Yeah, I mean, when you look at the history of transitional justice, which I'm afraid is what we're really talking about, we're talking about a transition from a worse democracy to a better democracy. What you find is that usually there are several parts of the legal process. There's not, I mean, the Nuremberg trials are famous, but usually there's not one silver bullet trial. There are usually several things that happen to several people. Obviously, the individuals who commit simple crimes in storming the Capitol should be found and prosecuted. Obviously, there's a moral and an ethics and possibly even a legal case to be made against congressmen who say, even though we are elected, we would like to overturn elections as such. And then, of course, there's the broader issue of impunity. Are we going to look at a man like Donald Trump, who has carried out outrageous actions, not only on the 6th of January, but other times, and say some people are above the law and other people are not above the law? He could face trial in the Senate. He could also face trial for seditious conspiracy afterwards, as well as, I think, for a number of other things.
You write a lot about Germany between the First and the Second World Wars, and there are two real takeaways that I've had from you. One is that in not accepting the loss of a war, in our case, a loss of an election, it set the table for Germany's loss, for the creation of World War II and Germany's loss in the Second World War. But the other point that's interesting is the degree to which, in the 1930s, Germany was a fully functioning, high-level society with that respected science and academia and the arts and democracy, and then suddenly it wasn't. And the point you make is the speed with which a functioning democracy can come apart if we are not protectors of it.
Plenty of other historians have made that point. I mean, look, the 20th century could have been Germany's century, and they blew it. I mean, industrially, politically, in the arts and culture, the 20th century could, maybe even should have been their century, but they blew it. And the way they blew it, the way they started to blow it, was with a big lie. When something went wrong, the loss of the First World War, many Germans, important Germans, told themselves the lie that this was the result of internal enemies, this was the result of the Jews plotting against us, and so on. Too many people believed that big lie, and that big lie became part of the fictions that brought Adolf Hitler to power. So when the United States at the beginning of the next century is facing another big lie, we can do the wrong thing, we can keep telling ourselves that big lie, or we can do the right thing. We can face the facts, get the history right, and then we have a chance to continue with the rule of law, to continue with democracy, and then maybe this century will turn out better for us than it's looking right now.
Professor Tim Snyder is a professor of history at Yale University. He's the author of best-selling books, including On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Those lessons are remarkably relevant right now. Professor Snyder, thank you again for joining us. All right.